before we sort of dive in, I want to just give a brief introduction to Anna. So Anna, our presenter today, she has been involved in natural resource management for 30 years, having worked in New South Wales government in a variety of roles from environmental regulation, catchment planning, and coordination, and also resource policy and implementation. And then she moved to Dunedin in 2020 and has worked with the Otago Regional Council in planning and policy, and now environmental implementation as a principal advisor leading the integrated catchment management program. So really lovely to have you here, Anna, today, and to be hearing about what your experiences are with the conservation standards. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to you now, Anna.
Kia ora, thanks, Haojin. Kia ora koutou, ko Anna Malloy toko whenua. Thanks for that introduction. I don't think I need to cover off and all that, but it's nice to see a whole lot of other Australians online. Hearing the accents, quite nice. So yes, I'm in Dunedin and looking after the Otago regional area for integrated catchment management. But I am originally from Newcastle, so Awabakal country, and spent a lot of time looking at the Hunter and Central Coast catchments there and the Catchment Management Authority work, which is gone by the wayside into local land services these days. But I don't know if any of you are from New South Wales, so I won't go there. But what I'm going to share with you today is not obviously everything, capturing the journey we've had over the last couple of years in conservation standards and integrated catchment management. It's obviously a very complex topic. I'll try and pull out some highlights, I guess, to show you our experience. It's by no means the solution. It's what we've muddled our way through to find, and hopefully you'll all be able to take something from it. So I'll share my screen, and hopefully it's the right one. And then I'll hit present. So hopefully you'll just see one slide rather than the full presentation slide, but let me know if that's not working for anybody. So ki uta ki tai, from the mountains to the sea. Basically, before I get into anything else, whilst I'm providing this presentation, it's not all of this work that I'm going to show to you, it's not mine, it's a team effort. And I just want to acknowledge those people in my team who have been a key part of developing all of this. All aspects from the design, the function, the thinking, and the brainstorming we go through. So Sophie Byrne, Charlie Richardson, Renee Pearson, Brooke Clark, and Simone Langens. No particular order, except I think that's the order they joined the team in. So thank you very much to them, if any of them are online. So ki uta ki tai, ministry, and there are a lot of different, I guess, definitions or meanings behind this, but basically, for me, it's another way of looking at integrated catchment management. It is looking at the recognition of the interconnectedness of the whole environment. So from the mountains down to the sea, the lakes, the lagoons, the groundwater, the land, and the soils in between. So for this presentation, I'm going to just keep using the term ICM. It's a little bit easier, but it's all about that whole of system approach that we're looking at. So today, hopefully going to look at a little bit of a background where we came from, that is where ORC came from in this space. What do we mean by integrated catchment management? How are we delivering that through catchment action plans? How do we come across the conservation standards and how we're using them? And then showcasing that in the pilot that we're undertaking in the Catlins, which is an area in Otago. So the background, this is not a history of ORC, and when I joined there in 2020, I was in their policy team. So to me, it appeared the focus was on regulating fresh water. And to be fair, I think that's really where it was. They're in the middle of, or the beginning of developing their new land and water regional plan, which for those in Australia, regional councils are tasked with regional planning, which is kind of like a mix between a state environmental planning policy and a local environmental plan. So it's really setting the rules for what you can do with the environment. So it's quite a regulatory process. And in this case, the focus is on the receiving waters of the fresh water. So not really even the estuary or the coast, the marine environment. But in 2021, the Otago Regional Council developed a long-term plan. And in that, they'd gone through consultation with, put out the question to the community, what do you think about us developing an integrated catchment management approach or an integrated catchment planning approach? And there was an overwhelming, well, not really overwhelming, but there was quite a lot of interest and support for that. So the council embarked on that new approach, which was relatively new for all the people who are currently working at the council. But in looking at that, they advertised a role, and I thought, oh, I've done a bit of that stuff. I might apply for it, and then got tasked with developing the framework for integrated catchment management. So that framework, I guess we started with what are the principles, understanding what is it that we're building upon here, what the scale is that we're going to work at, who needs to be involved, and then, of course, how we're going to do it. So those principles really started with what do we understand by integrated catchment management? And there's multiple ways of looking at it, but basically one of the best definitions I've come across, which is nice and simple, from the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, was it's a process through which people develop a goal, agree on shared values and behaviours, make informed decisions, and then act together to manage the natural resources of their catchment. So it is about some key things there. It's collaborative, it is about working together, and without that, you're unlikely to make as good a success as possible with the planning. We do need to use best available knowledge. We're not always going to know everything, so we need to be able to act on what we do know. It's focused. So what we do know shows there's a lot we need to do, and we can't always do all of it at the same time. So we need to be able to target that approach. And I think it's important to be accountable, track what we're doing what we say we do, and being able to use that to adapt if needed. So they're the 5 principles we sort of developed and have really stuck to for our ICM program. Apologies, I've got a really scratchy throat, so if I start sounding a little bit choked up, it's just getting a bit sore. So in terms of the scale, you can see, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but here's New Zealand, and the coloured areas are different regional council areas. This green one down the lower end of the South Island is Otago, and so this is the Otago region here. All up, it's about 32,000 square kilometres, and the blue lines in between are what they call freshwater management units. So Otago is broken into 5 freshwater management units. This big one here is all of the Clutha. We've got the Tyree, North Otago, some coastal areas, and the Catlins. This really large one is then further broken into rohe, or areas, because it is so large. And they were the boundaries utilised for the water planning process that I mentioned before. So it made sense to us to look at that scale, in which we would then help roll out or deliver integrated catchment management. The who, this is one of the other questions. Well, our partners in all of this are mana whenua, and they are the traditional owners, if you like, or mana means authority, whenua is land, so people with the authority of the land. So I'm not an expert in these translations, by the way, that's just one way of taking it. Down the left-hand side there, you can see mana. These are the kind of the principles behind how iwi, which are the people, look at their relationship with everything they do. So there's the authority, the life force of the environment. The whakapapa is your connection, your genealogy, your ancestry. And then you've got kaitiaki taka, which is guardianship, down through respect and memories and recollections, kinship, and through shared experiences. So in New Zealand, we have treaty partners, and that's really Regional Council, Otago Regional Council, have mana whenua of the 7 or so runaka who are in our region, who are our partners that we work with on all things that we do. And this ICM approach really resonated with the way Kaitahu, that's the main tribe, if you like, of the South Island, with the way Kaitahu look at the environment. So it recognised that in connection between land, water, coast, plants and animals and people. So for them and the descendants after them, this is something that's really interesting and of value to them. So they were obviously a partner regardless, but we were lucky that they really wanted to get on board as well as they did. The other big who is the community, and by that it's a very broad brush base. But the main thing is that the ICM and its delivery has to be owned by the community for long-term success. They're the ones who live in the place that will be looking for the benefits and implementing the solutions and identifying the problems. We were keen to incorporate a broad range of interests and knowledge. So we looked at, expressions of interest of people from all sorts of backgrounds, people who had a connection to the local environment or the people who had freshwater or biodiversity conservation knowledge, or industry knowledge, forestry, fishing, farming, etc. We also looked for other key stakeholders like the district councils or non-government organisations such as Forest and Bird or Fish and Game. We also needed to make sure that community had the ability and time ability to commit the time to the process we were looking at. So the big question was how? How do we deliver integrated catchment management? From my experience in New South Wales, where I worked a lot on catchment action plans, I thought, why not use catchment action plans? The term is pretty boring, I know that, but it's sort of stuck. And in very early days, and I don't expect you to be able to read this, sorry, it's just to give you an example of this sort of hierarchy of how I had previously worked on catchment action plans, this logical approach to if you have your goals or your high-level outcomes at the top, you have a vision perhaps or a goal, then you break it down into some intermediate goals that might be split up by environmental value or theme. These boxes here are all sorts of activities one would undertake in which to achieve the goals, and then you have your foundational resources, the things that you already have that set the scene, which you can build upon to undertake work to achieve your outcomes. So I was promoting that kind of general approach to the council, and alongside that we had some key areas of constraints, I guess, if you like, for the framework. That we had identified the catchment as a geographic boundary. Just because catchment works with water doesn't mean it works with biodiversity, but it's a logical kind of boundary to use for in the environment. As I just mentioned, looking at this program logic approach, making sure what we do is contributing to an outcome we're after, and then being able to monitor that. We were very interested in developing it on a spatial online platform so that it was adaptable and interactive and widely accessible. And as I mentioned before, building on and incorporating existing frameworks, but also the work that's already underway. There's a lot of work underway within Otago and other parts of New Zealand where communities or district councils have headed down an approach like this or something similar in various levels. So didn't want to be coming over the top and seem to be replacing that. Also, just acknowledging that the interconnected nature of all of this needs to consider the social, economic, cultural considerations that are going on in a place. So why conservation standards? Yeah, we sort of like came across it by accident. Weirdly, having worked in this natural resource management field for so long, I had not come across it. In New South Wales, just don't seem to have picked it up, not when I was there at least. And it's not something I'd heard of. However, I think really the connection came because Otago Regional Council was sponsoring one of the larger umbrella conservation groups who were running a 5-day workshop using conservation standards. Because we were sponsoring it, my boss said, oh, you have to go along to that. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. Yep, why not? 5 days up in a ski resort in the mountains sounds pretty tough. And when I got there, I guess having been doing kind of conservation planning, integrated planning for a while, I think, oh yeah, it's just another way of doing the same old thing. And surprisingly, it was, but it was better than that. It was really well set out. It was tried and tested. It resonated with me with all the experience I'd had before, and it had that logical approach or theory of change approach. So the other great things that it had, I should mention, we had done a bit of background research through an external consultant to just understand the community about what kind of interest or space there might be for integrated catchment management. What are the risks? What are the pitfalls? How does the community feel about ORC? And in that document, there were a lot of things we came out that we were quite aware of. There was a bit of distrust with the ORC, with the Regional Council, that is. There was consultation fatigue. There was a bit of cynicism about, oh, yeah, you're just going to develop this anyway. But one of the key, so that really pointed us towards a few things that we really need to be aware of. One, had to be collaborative, but genuinely collaborative, and build on that grassroots approach. And Conservation Standards does that, which is great. Conservation Standards also built on that program logic or theory of change that I mentioned. I think it's also results chain is one of the components, the terminology that's used. It's focused, and that hits one of those principles I was talking about before. So it's about looking at the strategic use of resources. When you've got limited resources, what's your best return on that level of investment? It can build on the existing work. So the framework allows you to, in some ways, pre-populate existing values, experiences, and so on. You don't have to start with a blank sheet of paper. And we really love that it was supported by that online planning and tracking tool, the Miradi. And I'll talk about that in a wee bit. But also that online component was something we were very keen on, that this was not going to be a document that sat on a shelf gathering dust. And I really think the Conservation Standards approach is very adaptable, not only as you're using it, but you don't have, it's open source, so you can use whatever parts of it you need for your purposes, which is fantastic. So I know I'm speaking to everybody who's used this, I assume, but just to put it so we're on the same page for this particular presentation, this is how we see the steps, and we've been using them at this landscape scale approach. So I'll work through this quite quickly. As you know, usually start with the vision and scope, being the scope, the geographic boundary, or the issue-based, and the time frame. You identify values, environmental values generally, and human values. Look at the health of those values and where you want that health to be. We use the term pressures instead of threats. Then you look at what pressures are acting upon those values. We then rate or rank those pressures through the scope and severity and irreversibility kind of assessment. And then try and look at contributing factors. What's driving the actual threats themselves or the pressures? That then becomes your situation. This is where we're at now. This is how we see the situation we're in. And then we start to look at what we want to improve our values or reduce our pressures. And so for that, we develop strategies. Well, it's good to have an objective for those strategies so you can track them. And then a strategy can be quite large, so we try and break it down to activities. So what are you actually going to do? A project scale kind of stuff. And then, of course, around all of this, we need to monitor it. So we want to check that we're making a difference, that our goals are being moved towards, and that, as I said, we can track our outputs. Are we doing what we said we'd do? So that's the way we try to pull all these steps together for the group that we work with, because sometimes it can feel, I'll get to this a bit later too, I guess, but in working through the workshops, sometimes you're doing piecemeal. And so we like to remind how it all fits into that big picture. So for example, in the Catlins, we had this vision around deeply connected, involved communities thriving alongside enhanced natural ecosystems. One of the values is native terrestrial vegetation, or native vegetation, native terrestrial ecosystems was another word they used. We could assess that it's moderate, and our goal is that it's good. So we're moving from moderate to good by 2034. This is only an example, by the way. One of the key pressures acting on that is pest animals, and they are ranked or rated as a high pressure. And some contributing or driving factors of that is obviously the lack of control and the value of hunting in that area. So if we get rid of all the pest animals, people don't have anything to hunt. So that's where our situation is. We want to improve native vegetation. So we develop a strategy, which is a planting program. Our aim or our objective for that is to increase the extent by 5,000 hectares. That's huge. Obviously, probably this is just made up. And an activity for that is to increase our funding in priority areas. Another strategy might be that we want to reduce the pressures that are acting upon our values. So we have a browser control strategy. And for that, we're looking for co-funding for shooting on Dock Estate. And our objective would be to reduce deer numbers by, say, 50%. Then, of course, monitoring might be a bird count as an indicator of our good native vegetation. And tracking our progress against our objective is just a measure of hectares of native vegetation. So that's kind of like a 101 of CS, which I know you're probably aware of. So what did we actually do? We explored conservation standards through those workshops. Like I mentioned, I went to one, and then when I got a couple of staff on, I sent them off to Topor on another one. when we had a bigger team, I'm sure, as you saw, I've got 5 people doing ICM. We actually brought Pip over to give us a 5-day course in-house, which was about conservation standards, but also about facilitating conservation standards, which was excellent. Thanks, Pip. And in that time frame, we also had sort of done our own trials internally. We'd use real world examples and try to work out, can we run these steps ourselves before we even try it on real people? And in doing that, we adapted where needed. One of the things that is part of this whole framework is an ICM working group, which is a region-wide group that has councillors and mana whenua representatives and some community representatives on to help steer the program. So whilst we internally know fully well that we're heading in the right direction and we're doing really well, it's great to be able to test that with a group that aren't as deeply involved in the process. And then, of course, I'm going to get to, we piloted using conservation standards to develop a catchment action plan in the Catlins. So I'll pause there and glass drink and ask if there's any questions at this point. Nope. Excellent. Right, so how's it working in the Catlins? So the Catlins is, as I showed you on that bigger map, is this little area down here at the bottom of Otago. To be completely correct, this is the Otago part of the Catlins. The Catlins as an area actually takes in a bit more of this down here as well, probably that bit there. So we've got the bulk of it. It's one of the most beautiful parts of Otago. It's one of the most heavily forested parts of Otago, which is great. And so therefore it has a lot of natural beauty, but also not natural value in terms of biodiversity. So this is a freshwater management unit. Oh, I should point out, we do obviously work into the marine area, like the Regional Council technically has a 12 nautical mile buffer around it. So the marine environment is a part of our scope. To start off this process, we held a community meeting. And at that community meeting, we explained to whoever turned up, and we had about 45 people. We explained to them about integrated catch management, what we'd like to do, and how we would like to collaborate and join up with the community to help them develop a plan for this place. And then what would be, what that would entail, what sort of level of commitment would need from those people if they want to be a part of it. And then we asked for expressions of interest. And as I mentioned before, we asked for people to indicate what kind of background or knowledge or skill set they might be able to bring. So everything from mataraka kaitahu, which is like traditional knowledge, whether they were landholders in the area, what's their community connection, did they have terrestrial biodiversity skills, freshwater ecology, or fishing, hunting, agricultural, tourism, government legislation, heritage, etc. And then we actually had quite a few expressions of interest, so we did a bit of an assessment. And we appointed, the Regional Council appointed a series of community people that gave a really good range of ages, gender, location within the Catlins, as well as those those knowledge areas. We also had Runaka representation. So for Australians in the room, the Runaka are the like local councils of the mana whenua, of the traditional owners. And Forest and Birds, an NGO, Fish and Game, sort of a quasi-government group. Forest industry person is there, one of the district councils, Department of Conservation, and of course ourselves. So this integrated catchment group came together. And, excuse me, their role was, we set up a few initial meetings so people could get to know each other, and we could explain and set the expectations of what we were aiming to help them achieve. And it was important that the ICM team were the facilitators. We weren't dictating what went into the plan. We weren't even dictating how it came about, except we were providing that framework and the guidance for that. But it was important that the people who were part of the ICG felt that this was their plan. They were developing it for themselves without. And so after a couple of meetings and setting our scope and expectations, or talking about them, we had 1 to 6 or 6 workshops. At the moment, we've just done 5, coming up to number 6, at the end of August. And then following that, when we've got a draft catchment action plan, we aiming to have a community-wide workshop so we could present the plan and have a discussion around it and take on board any feedback. And then once we've got a final draft, take it to council for endorsement. So that's the process in a nutshell. As I mentioned, we're up to about just on workshop 5, we're coming up to workshop 6. Just a quick run through of what those workshops might look like. And again, I can't show all the work from workshop in a slide, but workshop 1, we looked at the values. This is an example of the environmental values. So we've got some of the big ticket items here and the nested values that were mentioned grouped underneath. Workshop 2, we did the good old value health assessment, which is never easy. In fact, probably need to come back to that a few times because we realized that over the course of workshops, the goals slowly evolved rather than setting them from the outset. And this is just examples of some of the worksheets we did. Workshop 3, we started to look at the pressures or threats to those values. And there's another one around the more coastal marine environment. So we found these just having loose paper on big tables worked really well. And then we would score on these big sheets. And then with the pressure ranking, we brought it all together in a Excel spreadsheet with all the sums done up and then color-coded. And I'll talk about this in the challenges, but we found that community do not like things color-coded or ranked at all. Everything needs to be read because everything's a problem. So workshop 4, we looked at the situation diagram. So we had the things they valued, we had some of the pressures and in discussing the pressures, some contributing factors. And rather than do this with them, the team developed a roughed out situation diagram on huge pieces of paper and took it to the next workshop, which enabled, it's a starting point. And it was really useful because the workshop participants then could scribble on it and add to it or change things. And you can see here they've added in soils. It was missing from their values from the outset. So it was a good opportunity to have that going like that. Of course, you can see all the diagrams going everywhere. It gets a bit convoluted, but help bring it together, I think, a bit for them. Workshop 5 didn't look like this at all. I don't actually have any of the outcomes from workshop 5 in a nice picture or anything. But basically, workshop 5, they looked at those strategies. And you can see from the previous slide, they started sort of looking at a few strategies. They started to come out of this situation diagram. I mean, I don't expect you to be able to read that, but it's sort of pointing to some of the solutions or possible solutions there. And then the reason I've grouped this like this is the strategies were these key orange boxes. I faded these ones out because, and again, one of the challenges, it's about perceptions of what is, where a strategy is needed. So, for example, one of these says manage septic tanks. Now that came in late in the piece. It wasn't identified as a pressure or an issue earlier, but it's suddenly, oh no, we need to manage them or monitor them or something like that. So we put it in, we put everything in, but it's about coming back to them, I think, and checking those sense checking whether that's a real problem because there's different opinions. So what we were able to start pulling together though at this point was back to the original thinking of a catchment action plan, which is more a program logic approach. Is you've got your vision at the top, put your values in, and it's important to show the human values there. Otherwise, I find the community, we found the community continually thinks something's missing. We put the strategies in here. So these are the things we're going to do that's going to achieve these outcomes. In this one, we haven't got the pressures in there, but we've got a version that has got it. And what really helped was, at least for our team and potentially for the community group, is these baseline or foundational actions. So foundational actions are those sort of things that we might need to do before we even get into the depths of these strategies, but also the baseline. What is the current situation? What's the world we live in? So this is looking at policy and regulations that already exist. So we don't have to repeat actions about, making sure people are doing the right thing. We go, well, actually, there's already a rule for that. Compliance may be an issue, but that's not a component of this CAP because there is a whole workforce looking at that issue. So it doesn't mean it's always perfect. It doesn't mean that they can't advocate for more compliance or changing rules, but it's about acknowledging that there is some regulations in place that, if followed, would help set a better baseline for where we're launching off from. So what's next for the Catlins? And I may have this a wee bit wrong, but basically, at the moment, up until August, I know the team are working on the results chain diagrams. So we've got a couple of these strategies and we're teasing them out into those activities. And what does this strategy mean? What are the pressure reductions we expect to see? What's the result of the control we expect to see? And then which values is it going to be acting on? This one has deliberately not got any of the lines on there. Whilst I'm not working heavily in Miradi, I've been told that if you leave the lines off, it's much easier to move things around and change things until you're ready for the final. When you put the lines on, everything can go a bit haywire. Just one of those little issues. So that's just an example of the strategy, a results chain for the weed control. And we're doing that for all those key strategy areas, pest mammals and the beach rehabilitation one and sustainable farming or land use practices, etc. And then, excuse me, throughout this whole process, the team, and in this case particularly Charlie, has been populating Miradi. So we really find Miradi really useful. Obviously, you've got the front end of it where you can look at it and read what you've put in. But the real benefit that's being explained to me is when you have those factors, any of these boxes, these factors, they're like a mini part of a database. So it's all linked. So you don't have to keep redoing something. You don't have to keep rewriting things. You change one, it changes it everywhere else. But also you can then display it in all sorts of different ways or report on it in different ways or have it exported in different ways because you really are populating a type of database, which is fantastic. So this is just a screenshot from our Miradi for the Catlins. And as you can see there, that's got that 12 nautical mile I mentioned before. The other thing about the online component is we weren't convinced Miradi was going to work for everybody. Obviously, it's quite a complex tool and it's great for project management and for tracking for us. But what we have also done is built these hubs. So they just look like a web page, but basically they're ArcGIS. They're ArcGIS Hub Premium. So what it does is we can get better maps, more sophisticated mapping, and it doesn't mean we have to convert stuff into Miradi or our values and pressures and actions in different, whatever visual format we like. You can use the story map kind of approach if you like, or more detailed mapping. But it enables that community input. So it's quite a ArcGIS hub people can log into and therefore can contribute to and add comments to, and in fact even draw on the maps, etc. Depending on what kind of level of access we allow. So it has got it's a way of collaborating as much as it is a way of communicating. And then we also can allow, so in terms of that interaction, the group who are developing the CAP can have that quite heavy level of interaction. We can also enable the wider community to follow the progress and to provide feedback at key points throughout the development. Although we did start this CAP a bit late, so it hasn't been online the whole time we're developing the CAP. It's online now, and we'll be adding to it as we get more and more information that is at a point that's useful, not that it's going to change rapidly or be updated every few weeks. So when we've got to a sort of a final draft. So that's our online platform. Within that, we can embed a link to or components of Miradi. Well, we're not really embed, but draw in the aspects we need to. And the next thing we're doing is, I know I've talked about the Catlins as our pilot, but as you saw on that map of Otago, we've got 8 or 9 different subregions. So we're starting in the Upper Lakes next, which is probably going to kick off in a couple of weeks, which is really exciting. Very, very different landscape to the Catlins. It's not on the coast, it's in the mountains. It's got 3 deep water lakes and a very engaged and populous community who have been working on conservation for quite some time. So we've got a whole new series of challenges up there, which will be exciting. And I expect our approach will have the same principles, similar approach using conservation standards, but it will change yet again, depending on that group up there, which is the beauty of using something like conservation standards. So, excuse me, I'll pause again. You can ask any questions at the moment before I get into this. Okay, so what do we work well? I mean, obviously I've covered a wee bit of this as we've gone, but that collaboration with the community has been fantastic. We always intended that, having that process that Miradi, conservation standards gives you, and you pick and choose whichever bits you want. Oh, but you get that standard framework. Having a structure to follow really worked, and we're setting it out via workshops. Brought the community along with us, and we've had some really positive feedback from people in that process who have found it really useful, very engaging, and I think they haven't used the word trust so much, but they really reflected that they trust what the ORC are trying to do here, and they feel they're part of it. So that's been fantastic for us. The logical approach to complex issues, breaking down the ecosystem and the problems within it are very complex and wicked problems even. So having that logical approach really helps break it down a wee bit, but brings it back together. So you don't lose the interconnectedness, but you get that, for me anyway, it works very well with the logical approach to why you're doing what you're doing, what you expect to achieve, and checking that you are getting there. As I mentioned before, not always starting with a blank sheet. In the Catlins, there wasn't a whole lot of work had been done by the community around conservation management or any land use management planning. But so we started with the values, and everything was quite a blank sheet. By the time we got the situation diagram, as you saw, we presented them with, this is what we're hearing from you, and that worked really well. However, in the Upper Lakes, there's years worth of information of values, issues, and problems that the community and others have been working on up there. So in some ways, we're going to be going to them without a blank sheet, saying, we've read all your previous work in all these multiple documents. Here's a synthesis of perhaps what the values might be. Is there anything missing? So I think not always starting with a blank sheet works well, but there's that fine line between doing all the work for them and bringing them along for the ride. So I think capturing the plan, so to speak, in Miradi, as I mentioned before, I think it's a really powerful tool. It does take a lot of time to get it in there properly. You don't have to fill in every box, of course, but it can be really, really useful. The training we've had and the ability to go to those training days across the country in New Zealand were fantastic. And then having the more in-depth training with PIP for our team was essential. It was really good. It gave the team who are about to embark on developing these catchment action plans in the real world with a community group of people who are a bit unknown to us, the confidence, I guess, to just jump in and do it. And as I mentioned, having that team support, it's whilst we have allocated roles to do certain parts of this process, we're constantly coming together and talking through the challenges amongst ourselves. So that's been a really big plus for us, having the team of 5 or 6 of us working on this together. In terms of challenges, and I know I've also mentioned a few of these as we've gone through, the scale at which we're working, it is catchment scale, and it's not huge, compared to areas I've worked in Australia. It's not, but this might be a difference that only I've observed. But in New Zealand, there's a huge focus on the detail. Everybody wants to, it's sort of looking at the minutiae of everything. There's a huge amount of freshwater data, for example, but it's never enough. No, we need more. We need more. And I'm used to coming from I know it's a lot better now, but in the Hunter catchment, same size as Otago, I think there were 2 freshwater monitoring points when I stopped working there about 10 years ago. And, in Otago, there's 300. So I don't know how much more data they want, but it means that working in the landscape system in New Zealand can be quite complex because there's that focus on the detail. And it's being able to bring ourselves up above a wee bit and look at the bigger picture or the landscape scale. That's been a bit of a challenge. But it's not just that issue is not just focused on New Zealand. I shouldn't say that. I felt the same in New South Wales to a degree. Getting the values right. Oh God, lumping and splitting. It's a work in progress. Again, it's about getting into the detail, but not going too high. It's an area that you could spend days on. And I think sometimes coming back to it after you've gone through the process helps, because then you go, well, actually that value is far too high. Well, that's not really the value we're after. It's one of the nested values that we're talking about. So having that ability to go back and revisit some of the work that has happened in your workshops means that not focusing on a linear process, but a more of a reiterative process or an iterative process is essential. As I mentioned, the ranking of the pressures. Well, when we went back and said, okay, thank you for the work, we've scored all these against those 3 key criteria. These are obviously your highest pressures because they're red and they're high, and these ones are low. And they was like, no, they're all high. They're all high. So we just said, well, what do we do with that? He said, well, actually, if you think about it, amongst these 6, no, it doesn't matter. It's still a big problem. There's that fear of missing out. They did not want to see anything marked green or low because then it's not going to be addressed. And it's a really hard one to tackle. So we decided we wouldn't color code anything after that. But we needed a different way to focus them on the key issues, whether they be pressures or values or strategies, because, you know, that principle of we can't do everything needs to come through in a better way. I don't know why it's just skip one there. So there's that, there, focusing the strategies, as I mentioned, trying to focus all the work we do. How do we know where to start the strategies? We can't do pest management across all of the Catlins. So we are working now on criteria to help that decision making of where do we start first, perhaps in the first 5 years, and then we revisit that. And that brings up another challenge of building those results chains for the strategies. If your strategies are quite broad brush, you know, your results chains are going to be also necessarily quite complex because there's a lot in them. So again, pitching at that right level of detail becomes a bit of a challenge. It's not insurmountable, but it just means that it needs a bit of practice, we found. And sense checking those community perceptions. I mentioned the ranking of the pressures, everything was a big issue. But also, you might have heard me mention about the septic tanks that came in late in the piece. Now, it hadn't been mentioned as a potential issue. There was no potential talk about E. coli in the rivers coming from septic tanks, but it was suddenly put in there. So we don't want to tell the community, no, you're wrong, you can't have it, but also we are working through a way of working with our science team in the regional council to get any data about septic tanks. Are they an issue in the Catlins, or is it just an unknown whether they're an issue at all? And so keeping them there, putting them as a placeholder and saying, why don't we leave it there, do some more work on it, and then that's the first step in that strategy, working out if they're an issue and if at what scale would they be an issue. This is probably the biggest one. Using the conservation standards, you start focusing right from the outset. You start rating your health viability of your values, and looking at your pressures or threats, ranking your threats. It kind of then focuses you on the key bits of information, which is great. But I think the community, hence the septic tanks coming in and all the pressures being rated red, there's this feeling that something's missing, and that if it doesn't get in there, it'll never get in, and we're focusing on the wrong thing. So yeah, I think some ways of looking at how we make sure we're capturing everything, but we're focusing on the things we need to focus on, perhaps. But that's probably that probably sums up a lot of the issues or the challenges we've had in working with the community, is that fear that, if it's not in there, I won't get that done, and I won't get any support from the regional council on it. And finally, time and resources. Whilst we've got a really great group in the Catlins, they can't all make it to all the workshops. Our Runaka representatives are typically the ones missing. Their capacity to be involved, even for a day a month, is really hard. And so we are happy to, but having to make time outside of the process to make sure they're up to speed with where the process has gone. Because once you've started it, it's really hard to stop for 1 or 2 people. But if they're essential to the process, we needed another way of bringing them in. And so, yeah, time and resources. We do have the resources, that's been great, but the people at the community group and the people, they're giving up their own time and resources to be a part of this. So that puts a big target on us to make sure it is successful. And that's the end. So I'm not sure what the time is, I'm nearly done. That took way long. Oh, we had introductions. I didn't speak for the whole time. We'll stop.
That was really interesting and very informative, and I really liked the diagrams, and like I'm sure heaps of this is definitely heaps of work condensed in what, about half an hour to 40 minutes. So and great to hear that it has worked for you and your team, and also with Miradi as well. I do have a couple of questions actually. If nobody else has anything burning, I might just kick us off the discussion session with just the first question. So you mentioned that you had contracted somebody to look at sort of maybe the general feelings of towards the regional council before you started the whole consultation process. So how did you approach the process overall? Did you have someone, a representative who had really key relations in the community, or who was really prestigious in the community to do that kind of relationship and relationship building first, or relationship mending probably? And then probably the related question is how did you sort of introduce this process to people without sort of going into the detail, and were people sort of trusting you to lead them in this process? If you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure. So the background work was, we actually just put it out to expression interest to a couple of local consultants. Well, actually, one of them wasn't local, and that's would have been great, because you sometimes get that objective insight. But we went with a local consultant who worked quite a lot with the community groups, so they had their own history. We weren't after that consultant to mend any bridges or to look for or to implement any solutions in disconnect between the regional council and community, more to give us a lay of the land, so to speak. What do the community, what's their capacity to take on another process, and how do they feel about it? And it was clear that at that point, because most of our consultation, when I say ours, the regional council's consultation with the community had been through regulatory planning processes, and was therefore quite contentious. It was usually around water and water rights, and reallocating them or taking them away, or these sort of things. So yeah, it wasn't about mending those bridges, but just getting the lay of the land. Then building on that to actually talking to the community was a very slow process. First of all, I needed the council to be on board and to understand what we were trying to achieve. It's non-regulatory, it's completely voluntary, it's a win-win. We're doing this because we want to, not because we have to. We can't have our timeframes changed by the minister arbitrarily. This is something the regional council is embarking on for the community. So in the Catlins, it was a good place to get going quickly. And I was surprised at the level of people who want to be engaged, actually. But it was an area that ORC Regional Council hadn't had a lot of work to do in previously, which might have been a plus, because they didn't necessarily have disconnect or distrust. They might have been disconnected, but it was a really good win. And once we got started, that was when people started to see what could come of this. So it was a slowly approach. First introduction was, what is ICM? And then have a community meeting about, how can we deliver ICM? How can you be involved? And then getting them involved, and then doing it again and again. So yeah, it's about getting the message out consistently and clearly, but over time, and then actually showing up and getting into the detail of what you're talking about.
Thanks. Actually, Helen's just put a question in the chat around asking if you started with iwi first in the process.
Yes. So in Otago, we're lucky we have two consultancy-based consultants that represent Rūnaka, Okaha and Te Marama. So I can work with them and ask for their input on these things. So in early days, we had a couple of show and tells about what is ICM, what are we trying to achieve here, and had that quick feedback that this is great, this really resonates with what we want to see, keen to be a part of it. As our treaty partners, it was difficult time-wise for me or any of our team to connect one-on-one with all the Rūnaka before we went to the community. So that ICM working group I mentioned, which is a region-wide steering committee, if you like, that has that group has representatives from Okaha and Te Ao Marama, those two Roanoke-based consultancies. So the decisions and the thinking that goes on there goes back to their member Runakas for input. So I guess we've brought up the framework, the building the groundwork with them at a regional scale, and then developing the catchment action plans at that sub-regional scale. And we have those Runaka representatives on those committee or those integrated catchment groups. So yeah, trying to connect at operational governance and mana-to-mana scale level with our Runaka.
Thanks, Anna. That was really great. Any other questions coming in from the chat, or anybody from participants?
Yeah, I have a question. It's Michael here.
Hi, Michael.
Yeah, given Aotearoa New Zealand as being really a leader in implementing human wellbeing across its budgets and processes, how have you included that in your work that you've been doing, particularly with iwi?
Yep, with the catchment action planning process, really at the outset, looking at the values and for better or worse, we like the way the conservation standards talked about. I think they talk about conservation values and human values. We used environmental values and human values, and the message was the catchment action plan is focusing on the environmental values that we can have an impact on, that we see are at risk, and that those environmental values underpin our well-being. And that's why on one of those slides, it's really important for the community group that we're working with to see those human values there and link to those environmental values. So fresh water means that their land productivity and their human and their recreation and their safe health is underpinned by that. The amenity value of the Catlins, you can see that in their vision, is about, I didn't read it out, it's only a working vision as well, but it's about working alongside soft treating tourism for a thriving community. And even though we're focusing on the environment, so it's acknowledging, I guess, that the environment underpins all that well-being. We are steering just for pure necessity. We're focusing on those natural resource environmental values because we can't address the wider societal well-being issues that maybe have much bigger drivers than the area we're looking at. Yeah.
So have you implemented specific measures around well-being connected to the environmental outcomes?
No, not at this stage. And it's funny you mentioned that because I was just in pulling this together today. I was looking at an old slide and that one of those very first slides where I was looking at a potential framework diagram that everybody said, oh, it's not very user friendly. It's far too many boxes. I obviously think in boxes. But right over on one top right area, one of the boxes was resilience and community or connection, and it was under the people theme. And based on that, I had asked a Masters of Planning student project to do work on how can we measure people's connection to nature or their place. And they did a fantastic job using the Upper Lakes as a bit of a case study. So I'll be pulling that out again to look at how we can measure that level of outcome once we've got one of the first caps under our belt. So the other thing I didn't mention there is the catchment action plans can be huge. In terms of producing something that we can get on with rather than plan for several years, our approach has been, let's get the cap in its barest form. Well, I don't mean that in a bad way, but in a form that works, that covers the bulk of the key issues and the problems and the values that people want to see. Work on that and have those additional things come on board when we evolve and become more sophisticated with what we're looking at. So that's the adaptability, that is not just adapting, are we moving in the right direction? Are we doing the right things? What can we add to this now? And that's where I think conservation standards and that online approach allows us to do.
Thanks, Anna, and good question, Michael. I think this is always top of the mind for everybody, and it can come up as as Anna pointed out in her slides, that it can come up as considered as something missing. Are we missing something and this is not quite covered? But that's we always come across that, and when talking to people. Unfortunately, we have come to a close of the webinar. It's 4 o'clock now, and Anna Pip has just popped in the chat a tip for you to address, to if people have differing opinions about ranking pressures.
I saw that. Yeah, it'd be really good. Is there a way of saving these chat and sending it out? Because I don't get a chance to read it all.
Yeah, we Sarah will be able to.
I can do that. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
And I can see Ord Loisia has a question about did the community discuss climate change issues? And no, not per se. We climate change and it's building its resilience to it in the Catlins at least has not come up as a key issue, and that might be because of the bulk of the community there. It's not on their radar, but definitely will be in the Upper Lakes. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Well, thank you. And if anybody thinks of questions, you can. Yes, exactly. And we've got another webinar coming up on the 26th of September. So the topic hasn't been confirmed yet for that webinar, but if you have an idea, you want to contribute, if you want to learn about something, please contact us. And Sarah's have put the email in the chat box. If you would like to suggest something. Otherwise, thank you everybody for your time, for attending this webinar. It's been really great to see all of you, and thank you so much, Anna, for sharing with us your experience. And it's very exciting, to learn that you're yet to do a couple of more ICMs.
Yeah.
You have our positive thoughts supporting you all the way on that.
Thank you.
Can I just say I'm really impressed with ORC, and I want to say a big thank you for being willing to share when you're partway through the process, because I think that's lots of us on the call have been doing things, but it's always really lovely to have people who are happy to put their hand up. And I think, again, particularly for the New Zealanders, I can see Renee's there. This team have really just dug in and helped each other, and Renee and Charlie perhaps have particularly explored Miradi. So, again, I think the ORC will be fine if you give them a call.
Yeah, definitely.
Say hi, but they really have been pursuing this, and I think doing a great job of just trying to take it forward and think about how to adapt it for New Zealand. So well done, team.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and we do encourage people to connect with each other as well. And if you need to connect, just let us know if you can't find their contact. All right, so with this, I will and Renee's just shared something in the chat as well. And this is just for Axie's work. Yeah. So with this, I will just close off the webinar with a karakia. He karakia whakakapu. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapu nui, kia wātia, kia mama te ngākau, te tinana, te wairoa i te ara takata, hoia rā e rongo, whakaira a te ki runga, kia tina, uie, kai.